Physiowebseries, Nervous System, Season 1. Let's begin with Series 1. In Series 1, we will study about vertebrae in human body. So we can appreciate there are 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic and 5 lumbar, and then 5 sacral and coccyx. Sacral and coccyx one are fused vertebrae. So now, after this, we will see the spinal nerves which are exiting above or below the corresponding vertebrae. So which one exits above the corresponding vertebrae and which nerves exits below the corresponding vertebrae, we will have a look at that. So as in this diagram also, we can appreciate from the foramen magnum from brain, as the spinal cord leaves the brain to descend down. So it exits from the foramen magnum below, and this is the spinal cord traversing through the vertebral column, where here you can find the start of conus medullaris, then below it there is cauda equina, and then phylum terminale. So this is the gross idea of spinal cord we have, or the vertebrae we have. So now coming to the main topic, the spinal nerves exiting from the corresponding vertebrae. As in this diagram we can see, for example, this is the C3 vertebrae. Above that C3 vertebrae exits the C3 spinal nerve. Then from C4 vertebrae, above that exits the C4 spinal nerve. Above this C5 vertebrae exits the C5 spinal nerve. Similarly, this will be C6 vertebrae. Above this exits the C6 spinal nerve. Similarly, over here also, for C1 to C7 vertebrae, the corresponding spinal nerves will exit above that vertebrae. So this is C1, C1 spinal nerve, C2, C2 spinal nerve exiting above the vertebrae. C3, C3 spinal nerve more clearly can be seen. C4, here is C4 spinal nerve. Then C5, C5 spinal nerve. All these nerves are exiting above the corresponding vertebrae. C6, above C6 there will be C6 spinal nerve. Above C7 there will be C7 spinal nerve. But now there is one extra spinal nerve in cervical segment, which is C8 spinal nerve. So where will it go? It will occupy the space below C7 vertebrae. So C8 spinal nerve will exit below the C7 vertebrae. But from C1 to C7 spinal nerves, we saw they exit above the corresponding vertebrae. Only C8 spinal nerve is that which doesn't have the space as we can see. So it will exit below the C7 vertebrae. Same way in this view also we can see how from the intervertebral foramina the nerve is exiting out to reach certain body parts to supply there. So from C1 to C7, the spinal nerves, corresponding spinal nerves, C1 to C7 spinal nerves, they exit above the corresponding vertebrae. As we just saw, there are total cervical vertebrae C1 to C7, but total cervical nerves are C1 to C8. 8 cervical nerves, spinal nerves. So C1 to C7 nerves, they exit above the corresponding cervical vertebrae, but C1, so that means C1 will exit above the level of C1 vertebrae. Now if for example we consider C8 nerve, which is extra, so that will exit below the corresponding vertebrae, that is below the C7 vertebrae, because there are 7 cervical vertebrae itself. So C8 spinal nerve will exit below the C7 vertebrae. That means this C8 nerve will be present between C7 and T1. So this is important to remember that C8 will be present between C7 and T1. If we consider T1 nerve, it will exit again below the T1 vertebra, because as the story has started from C8 nerve, spinal nerve, it is going or exiting below the C7 vertebra. So now after that T1 vertebra is there, so the T1 nerve will not have place above, so it will again go below. So below the T1 vertebra. That means T1 spinal nerve will lie between T1 and T2. Continuing with this concept, here also we can see the same thing. There are 8 cervical nerves. The 8th one will exit below the C7 vertebrae, but till C7 we can see the nerves are exiting above the corresponding vertebrae. Similarly for lumbar, over here we can see this is L2 and the nerve, L2 nerve, spinal nerve is exiting below the L2 vertebra. L3 also we can see it is exiting below. Similarly for L4, L5 can be appreciated in this diagram very clearly. So this was relationship of basically the cervical and lumbar nerve roots, as can be seen in this diagram, to the intervertebral disc. So here all together the picture we can see, if we consider this box as the vertebrae, this rectangular blocks as the vertebrae, considering in between the spinal cord passes and the nerves which are coming bilaterally to supply, to reach to specific body parts and to supply there from this spinal cord, they will come out from intervertebral foramina. So we can see that how the nerves are exiting. C1 is exiting above C1 vertebrae. Similarly till C7 the story will go on. Then for C8 nerve it will be exiting below C7. So again the next vertebra, which is T1, that corresponding nerve will also now again go below the T1 vertebrae. Similarly for T2 and the rest, we can see somewhere around T12 the conus medullaris starts, and then comes the cauda equina at this level, then phylum terminal. So all those things also can be clearly appreciated. And one thing, that from C1 to C7 nerves, they will exit above the corresponding vertebrae, but from C8 nerve to below in the spinal cord, those nerve roots will exit below the spinal cord. So this difference we need to lock in our mind, and hence we can understand that if we consider the C5 nerve, for example, where will C5 lie? It will be above C5 vertebrae. That means between C4 and C5 vertebra. So the C5 vertebra will lie between C4, the C5 spinal nerve will lie between C4 and C5 vertebra. We can just understand that this concept. If we consider C6 nerve, so C6 nerve will arise above the C6 vertebra. This is the C6 vertebra, and above the C6 vertebra, C6 nerve will arise. So that means C6 nerve lies between which two vertebra? Between C5 and C6. Between this, the C6 nerve lies. But it gets reversed in C8 and so on nerves. So C8 nerve lies below C7 vertebra. That means this is going to lie between C7 and T1 vertebra. The C8 nerve will lie between C7 and T1. If we consider T1 nerve, so T1 nerve is now lying again below the corresponding T1 vertebra. That means it lies between T1 vertebra and T2 vertebra, which is this and this. Between T1 T2 lies the T1 nerve. So this will form foundation for rest of the topics to apply clinically. So hence need to remember this basic concept as discussed over here. Till C7 cervical vertebrae, the corresponding spinal nerves will exit above them. As the C8 enters, C8 spinal nerve comes into picture. that C8 will go below the C7 cervical vertebrae. Hence, below it, T1, T2, and so on, all spinal nerves will start exiting below the corresponding vertebrae. And hence, we can come to a conclusion like to find out which nerve exits between which two vertebrae. So, this was regarding the neurological anatomy to understand in series 1.